Before the break, we were just looking briefly at Hume, and I tried to give you at least the most quick, essential analysis of Hume. Hume is a brilliant thinker. He's a great opponent of the Christian faith, and if I'm tempted, of course, to spend a lot more time on him because I want to, respond to Hume, and that I have to resist that temptation. But simply to say this, that the importance of Hume for our purposes is that Kant read him. And Kant, who had up until that time been a very nondescript professor of philosophy, who lived a very quiet and basically vanilla life, read Hume, and he says in one of his later writings that he says, quote, "I was awakened from my dogmatic slumbers." That's been a little phrase connected with Hume, or with Kant, his dogmatic slumbers. And of course the point was that as Kant read Hume, he not only saw this assault against the theism that had been classically assumed, and by the way, Kant himself was certainly a theist, but what Kant realized and was bright enough to recognize in Hume was that Hume was not only, or maybe I should put it this way, if Hume was right, he had not only stripped the foundation out from under the theistic proofs, that is, he had proven that we can never know for sure that there's a God, but Hume had also succeeded in proving that we can never know anything, you see. That in fact, the whole basis and premise for knowledge, for any kind of reasoning process, presupposes contradiction and causation. And in fact, if those two principles are abandoned, knowledge itself ceases to be. And so Kant was disturbed because being a person engaged in the discipline of knowledge, being a professor, he saw the necessary implications of Hume to be much more far-reaching than Hume had ever suspected, and or at least had ever intimated in his writings. And so Kant sets about a task in his philosophy of trying to rescue knowledge. And that's what's important. He's on a rescue mission. He's trying to rescue reason. He's trying to rescue experience. Kant is trying to rescue science. He's also trying to rescue faith and religion. So he's trying to rescue all of these things for the benefit of Western society, because he figured if Hume finally overcomes and wins the premise that he's developing, then all of this will be lost and will be cast into a complete and total abyss of chaos. And he was concerned about that. So how did he do it? Well, here we go. Kant did this by making a distinction. Now, you've been in this class for 5 weeks and you've become very savvy about philosophical distinctions. And so you'll recognize immediately that the distinction that is being made by Kant is the same distinction that was made by Plato when he distinguished the ideal from the receptacle. It is essentially the same distinction made in the Scriptures between the supernatural and the natural. It's essentially the same distinction that was made in medieval theology between grace and nature. It's the same distinction that was made by Calvin between God and the institutions of the church and the state, and so on. We've seen this distinction again and again, so don't let the vocabulary throw you. What Kant calls these two worlds are the noumenal on the one hand and the phenomenal on the other. But essentially, it's the same distinction we've been working with all the way through. The noumenal world is the world that is the level, maybe I should say, that is supernatural, that is absolute, that is essential, that is transcendent. The phenomenal world is the world of phenomena, and by that he simply means experience. We do not experience the noumenal level of reality. We don't experience it. We experience experiences, which are by their nature this worldly and phenomenal. All right, in the noumenal level, Kant says, we find certain realities. We don't find them, but that's where they are. First of all, God is there. Secondly, self. That is the human self. You ever thought about that? How do you empirically verify the existence of the self? You are presumably subjectively aware of it, but it is non-verifiable. How do you put self in a test tube? Measure it out, weigh it. It's the locus of personal consciousness, and yet somehow it escapes our grasp for each one of us. And Kant locates that in the noumenal level. And the third item that goes up there is what he calls the, if I can say it, Dekon Zik, which means the thing in itself, or the essences of things. So again, you all think you're sitting on a chair, but you really don't know, you see. Because all you have is the empirical experience that is being translated to your consciousness through your senses. But your senses are an absolute barrier between you and what's really there. And what's really there is not immediately experienced. The thing in itself, or the essences of things, are beyond us. There's no way that we can verify that those things are really there. No way we can test it out. No way we can go and scientifically analyze those realities. Kant also makes the point that the principles of reason do not apply at the noumenal level. They don't apply. Because that noumenal level is a level of absolutes. It's a level of the infinite, and reason can only apply at the level of finite things. Now, the critical point in Kant is that even though we cannot verify the noumenal level, nevertheless, it is an absolute prerequisite for making sense out of the phenomenal level. We cannot know for sure that it's there, but unless it's there, anything that's here is pure chaos. So it's an absolute prerequisite, but we can't know for sure that it's really there. The phenomenal level is the level, as I said, of experience. It's the level of science. If there is such a thing as reason, the principles of causation and non-contradiction, then those principles apply at the phenomenal level. Let's see. But we cannot apply them at the noumenal level. All right. Now, that particular distinction has been of unspeakable significance in the history of Western thought. This line that I've drawn across here, you'll notice is a solid line. I have pictured it in weeks past as a dotted line. I should really make it more on the order of a slab, because what actually is coming out of Kant's philosophy, in fact it came to be called Kant's wall, and that's what it is. He is articulating in his philosophy the notion that that barrier that separates the phenomenal level from the noumenal level is an impenetrable barrier. You cannot get through it. Experience cannot get you past it. You live at the phenomenal level. You cannot, by experience, get to the noumenal level. It can't be done. The only way to get there by experience is in terms of a mystical or intuitive leap. You see, a leap, but you can't even verify that the leap got you there because it's purely intuitive. But there's no way to get there by some sort of actual experience. You cannot go and experience the noumenal level directly. You cannot get there by reason. Kant would say it's not possible to reason from the finite to the infinite. You cannot start with a finite proposition and conclude an infinite conclusion. And thus, Kant agrees with Hume that the classic arguments for the existence of God don't work because of that fact that we can't reason from this world to the other world. Nevertheless, Kant argues that as a practical matter, we must presuppose that the noumenal realities are there. Kant wrote two great works. The first of them is called The Critique of Pure Reason. And in The Critique of Pure Reason, he essentially develops what I've just summarized very simply tonight, is this distinction between the noumenal and the phenomenal, and the fact that we can't reason from the phenomenal to the noumenal. That's his argument in that first book. It's about 1,000 pages of the most incredibly complicated stuff that you could ever hope to read, and so I've reduced it for you. But there's a second book that Kant writes, and this is called The Critique of Practical Reason. And Kant argues in this book from practical necessity. And there's a sense in which what Kant does in this book is he brings back in the back door what he kicked out the front door. He says, kicking out the front door, the whole notion that we can ever verify the existence of God or the self or the thing in itself. But what Kant concludes is that if we're going to make sense out of life, we must presuppose those things. One of the most interesting arguments that Kant develops in Critique of Practical Reason is called the moral argument for the existence of God. Kant's moral argument. It's a very interesting thing because it doesn't prove that there is a God, you see. What it does prove is that if there is no God, there is no such thing as morality. That if there is no God, there is no such thing as ethics. That if there is no God, there is no meaning to our existence. That we are plunged into a hopelessly absurd abyss if there is no God. That's what the argument proves. It does not prove whether God is actually there. It just proves the consequences of the non-existence of God. Dostoevsky picked that up. You may be familiar with this little statement, a famous statement from Dostoevsky in his Brothers Karamazov, in which he says, if there is no God, what follows? All things are permissible. And isn't it true? If there is no God, then in an ultimate sense, there are no rules. Oh, well, there may be temporary rules that we invent. But if there is no God, ultimately, there are no rules. Anything goes. All things are permissible. He's simply, applying. Now, Dostoevsky didn't maintain that in terms of his personal convictions, but that was the proposition he was developing. If that's the case, then B naturally follows. There is no God, then naturally there are no rules, that anything goes. All right. Well, Kant has been very convincing, and it's safe to say that subsequent thinkers have pretty much accepted what Kant says as being the fact. Subsequent philosophy has essentially began on the premise that Kant is correct, that we cannot verify the noumenal level. We cannot verify whether there's anything really up there. And so subsequent philosophies have tended to play out the consequences of that. And I'd just like to very briefly try to give you, in the most thumbnail sketch kind of way, some of the consequences of Kant's philosophy that we've seen. Essentially, philosophies that have come after Kant have charted one of two courses. Either those philosophies which have essentially agreed with Kant that we cannot verify the noumenal level, and have, as a result, despaired of trying to do so, and therefore they become philosophies that focus strictly at the phenomenal level. That's the only concern. This would be, for example, a philosophy like positivism, which was made famous by William James. Positivism is a philosophy that simply attempts to know the facts, not to interpret them, not to relate them to any ultimate values, not to pass any kind of judgments, but just to catalog facts. William James, of course, is remembered particularly for his book, Varieties of Religious Experience. All he does in that book is, in a positivistic kind of way, document religious experience. No judgments are passed, no indication of anything correlating to ultimate truth. It's not his purpose, but simply a very positivistic kind of way. Just document the facts, you see. Another philosophy that comes out of this is that, again, despairs of noumenal reality, would be pragmatism, that simply says the only thing that matters is that which is pragmatic, that which works. We don't care if there's any ultimate value. That doesn't matter. We can't know anyway. It's just a utilitarian concern for whether things work. Another philosophy that came out of this and was very important in psychology is called voluntarism and phenomenology, which says that you cannot know the self. You are only the sum total of your experiences, you see. That you are explained simply in terms of the experiences that you have. And there's a very close connection between that and the contemporary psychological school called behaviorism, which treats you as a black box and says that you are simply a product of your conditioning. And if you've been conditioned to respond to life in a certain way, then that's the way you respond, and it's simply a matter of the sum total of your conditioning producing what you are. It's a kind of species of this sort of phenomenological approach that was originally developed by Schopenhauer in the 19th century, and then behaviorism, of course, is connected with Skinner in the 20th century. Another philosophy that is closely connected to Kant, which really takes him to the extreme, would be Nietzsche and the whole view of existentialism. There is only existence, there is not essence. And so existentialism focuses on existence as the raw expression of what we are without any attempt to try to suggest meaning. In fact, a despair that there could be such a thing as meaning. And finally, the philosophy of linguistic analysis, which has essentially despaired, again, of metaphysical concerns, of ultimate concerns, and has said the task of philosophy really reduces to helping other disciplines define their terms, which is an abysmal and tragic place for philosophy to wind up. But please see that when Kant convinced subsequent thinkers that we can't know the noumenal level, we cannot verify metaphysical, normative truth, what's left? Philosophy used to be called the queen of the sciences, you see. That great discipline that, in a sense, lent dignity to all the other disciplines. Now philosophy sits in an outhouse. Philosophy is busying itself with, with all due respect, trivial matters. As if the philosopher is now saying, look, I know that we've been dethroned, we're no longer the queen of the sciences, but please, at least let us help you define your terms a little bit. Can't we do something, you see? As if philosophy has no great value, and you can see why. Because philosophy is the one discipline that looked for the metaphysical truth, the truth that's up there. And if we can't know it, then what place is there for the philosopher? And why is it, you see, that we have such a disinterest in teaching and learning philosophy these days? A person that says, I'm going to college and major in philosophy, we look at them and think, what's the matter with you? You see, as if that's some crazy thing to do that has no particular notice that, no practical value, because we're so pragmatically oriented. We think that if it's not pragmatic, then it's worthless. We have bought off on Kant in such, in ways that I fully believe contradict our Christian faith. And yet we've done it, we've just absorbed it, hook, line, and sinker, because it's been fashionable in our culture, and we've bought the propositions of Kant. I don't have a lot of time to do this, but there was another whole school of thought that came out of Kant that took a slightly different tack, and I'll just for the sake of a quick overview mention those as well, even though they're slightly beside the point. The ones that I just mentioned, positivism, pragmatism, phenomenology, voluntarism, all of those, essentially despair of a noumenal level. We can't even know it. It's just blacked out. And philosophy and philosophical investigation reduces to a focus on the phenomenal level, or whatever's left, you see, once we've blacked out the noumenal concern. There was another school of thought which said, no, we can know, it is possible to know noumenal reality, because noumenal reality is present in the phenomenal world and plays itself out historically. Now, this is something like Aristotle's response to Plato. Aristotle says we can't know the ideal world, but we can find form within matter. Well, in a sense, the thinkers coming after Kant were saying something similar, but they added the new category of history. And so, for example, there was one great thinker who said, if we look at history, history is the unfolding story, the unfolding revelation of the absolute idea. And this absolute idea, this absolute reality, this noumenal reality, plays itself out in the dialectic of history. So he's called a dialectical idealist. And he says that what happens in history is you have a thesis countered by an antithesis. The struggle goes on between those two ideas, and they finally resolve into a synthesis. And then that synthesis becomes a new thesis, which triggers a new antithesis, and the struggle goes on till it resolves in a new synthesis. And all of history is this unfolding dialectical relationship between thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And as we study it and learn it, we will see the noumenal reality playing itself out in history. Now, that man's name was George Hegel. Hegel develops a extremely complicated philosophy, very obtuse in many ways, but that's fundamental to it. There's some other thinkers that come after Hegel that basically adopt his principal ideas but sort of change the players. So, for example, one thinker that reacts to Hegel but buys into a lot of what he says, he agrees that history is the story of a dialectical process. It's a dialectical process, but not a dialectical idealism, but a dialectical materialism. And the forces that are competing are not ideas, but material forces of labor and economics and class struggle. And thus what we see in history is the truth of what is playing out in these struggles between the classes. That man's name is Karl Marx. Another thinker who takes the same idea of Hegel, another 19th century thinker. These are all in the 19th century, you understand. Another one takes Hegel's idea, but applies it in the area of biology. So he's saying that it's not the struggle between the ideals or the struggle between the classes, but it's the struggle among the species. We have one species that has a strength and another one that comes up against it, and the one that's stronger survives, but it's changed a little bit by the struggle, and this survival of the one that is the strongest, but the gradual change is the story of what really is happening in history, and so translates the same proposition into biological categories, and his name is Charles Darwin. Then we have another thinker who takes the same idea but translates it into psychological categories and says the real story of what's happening is not out there but in here. And the struggle is between the dialectic of our superego on the one hand competing against the id on the other, and they resolve themselves in the ego. And who's he? Sigmund Freud. And so and there's other thinkers as well, but those are names that you recognize, and they all buy into a Hegelian approach in which they're trying to see noumenal reality in the phenomenal level, trying to find a basis for ethic, a basis for truth, but despairing of it being up there where it can't be verified. All right, my whole point in all of that, and I'll just throw those at you more or less shotgun approach, is just to give you some sense of this is what the 19th century was about. It was Kant, who's an 18th century thinker, and his philosophy hits home, hits the bloodstream in the 19th century, and all of these thinkers, and this was a most sweeping, radical transformation of thought. I mean, we are living in the Kantian age. We are not living in the Middle Ages. We are not living in the 16th century. The presuppositions of that time are gone, and they are gone largely because of the watershed effect of Immanuel Kant and those that came after him, you see. Well, what does this do to ideas about God? If you really buy into a Kantian view, then the only thing that one can conclude is that God ultimately becomes unknowable, you see. I mean, Hegel tries to give us a God we can know in this absolute idea, but not a lot of people got real excited about that, and for the most part, God becomes an unknowable thing. And the problem is, of course, if God is unknowable, it's only a short distance from there to God being irrelevant. And so we really live at a time when God is regarded as irrelevant. He is banished from the universe. He is no longer an active participant. You can have your faith if you want. If you want your faith, if you need that crutch, fine. But faith is now understood as something that happens in a little airtight compartment. You leap in there every Sunday morning. You experience whatever faith is for you within that private and subjective world, but don't you dare try to export the content of your faith into the real world. It doesn't belong out there, you see. Your faith is something you can have if you need it, that means something to you subjectively, privately, but don't you try to make your faith something that has an effect out in the real world. And what's interesting, of course, is that Calvin's original idea of separation of church and state has been twisted ever so slightly, but ever so significantly into a view that the church has no business participating in society. It is not your business. You stay inside your church. You can do anything you want as long as you keep the doors closed and the noise down, you see. But as soon as the church gets noisy, then the response is, what are you doing here? You've got no business here, because we're concerned with the facts. Science owns the facts. You can have faith. You see, as if there's no connection whatsoever. My beef is that we Christians have laid down and played dead at the feet of Kant. We have been the worst perpetrators of the crime because we've signed off on this as if he were right. One just brief illustration of this is, as you know, scattered across this country are many Christian colleges. They were founded, many of them in the 1800s, and they were founded on essentially biblical convictions, etc. Christian colleges. Do you know that if you go back in most of these Christian colleges and look at the time that they were formed, you'll find that virtually every one of them had what was called a department of theology. A department of theology. What is theology? Theology is the study of theos, of God, a noumenal reality. You know, something very subtle has happened. A lot of people don't even notice it, but it's happened with virtually in every case. Schools that started with a department of theology now have what? A department of religion. What'd you do, read my lecture? You ever thought about that? What's the difference between religion and theology? Theology is the study of God. Religion is the study of man. Religion is really a subcategory to anthropology. It's the study of what people do in practice with reference to what they believe is ultimate. That's religion. That's what the study of religion is. In other words, the shift from a study of theology to a study of religion was a shift from the study of noumenal things to phenomenal things. And unfortunately, our Christian colleges have capitulated to Kant at that very point. And it's subtle, and it's just one of countless examples that illustrate how the church has caved in, has bought off on the idea that Kant is right and that noumenal level cannot be known. All right, let's return to the point. Oliver Wendell Holmes. Oliver Wendell Holmes was born in 1845. He died in 1935. He is not to be confused with his father, who was also Oliver Wendell Holmes. But the son, Oliver Wendell Holmes, became a great Supreme Court justice and one of the most important and most influential thinkers to come to the Supreme Court and to indeed be the Chief Justice. Oliver Wendell Holmes was a close, lifelong friend of William James. They enjoyed a very close friendship. And Oliver Wendell Holmes applied in a practical sense in jurisprudence what William James was applying in his discipline. In other words, he began to advocate for what could be called a positivistic view of law. The net effect of Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was held in extremely high esteem in this country, was that it spelled the demise of the study of William Blackstone. William Blackstone, you recall, had stood for the idea that law ultimately has to be traced to natural law. Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote a great book in 1881, early really in his career, which had a profound impact through the years. It was simply called The Common Law. In The Common Law, Oliver Wendell Holmes took sharp issue with William Blackstone and finally won the debate. I'm going to reduce Oliver Wendell Holmes, as I've reduced all of these, to some very simple propositions. Two basic ideas. Number one, Oliver Wendell Holmes argues vigorously, page after page after page in this document, that laws may no longer be based on metaphysical norms. In other words, he argues that Kant is right. We cannot know what is up there. We cannot know what natural law is. We can't even know if there is such a thing as natural law. We have to despair at that point. Law can no longer be predicated on metaphysical norms. The idea of fixed and absolute norms built into the nature of things or otherwise is abandoned. Natural law is abandoned. Blackstone is abandoned. The whole approach is abandoned. And Oliver Wendell Holmes argues it must be. You may recall, I just mentioned in passing the other day, the difference between ethics and morality. Recall that? And I said that ethics has to do with fixed norms, and morality is a descriptive science that has to do with how people behave. Ethics is rooted at the noumenal level. Morality is a science involving the phenomenal level. The effect, really, of what Holmes is saying is that ethics collapses into morality, and the two terms essentially become synonymous. There is no longer such a thing as ethics. There is only morality, because there's no longer such a thing as fixed reference points for moral truth. So where do we find out the basis upon which laws should be founded? Well, Holmes argues this, that now laws must be based on the values of the contemporary society. You see, that's where we go to get law. We go to the contemporary society. There's no longer an objective measure of good and evil. There is only what is acceptable in the minds of the people. Now, when we first started, the first evening we were together, I gave you a little illustration. You remember it? It was a little old lady standing at a street corner. I just have this funny feeling that if you don't remember anything about this class, somehow that's going to stick in your mind. So I'm going to remind you of it now. Here's what I want you to think about. We reduced our options to two. You remember that? Here's the little old lady. Do we help her across the street, or do we run her down? Those are our options ethically as we're dealing with this human being. Now, most of us would say it would be preferable, if those are the only two options we have, to get out of our car and help her across the street. You see, most of us would agree that would be preferable to running over her in our vehicle. And we raise the question, why? Why is that preferable? Blackstone would say, the original theorists of the Constitution would say, and the Puritans would say, and all of those classic thinkers would say, because helping her cross the street comports with the nature of things more than running over her, which is contradictory to the nature of things. Now, Holmes would agree we should help her cross the street, but he would say it's because that's the value of the contemporary society. Now, I just want you to try on a little variation on my theme for a moment. What if this little old lady, what if the contemporary society decides that because she's little, and because she's old, or because she's a lady, or for any other reason, her value isn't worth so much? Her life doesn't count for so much, and that the protection of her life doesn't really matter so much to the society. That she, in fact, in terms of the contemporary society, is not something to be protected, that her life is not something to be treasured or valued, but that, as a matter of fact, she is expendable. What do we do in that situation? When the contemporary society decides that she no longer has any particular right to claim continued existence. Well, if Holmes is right, then the proper response to her at the little old intersection, you see, the proper response to her is to do society a favor and run her down. You see. And that's what I want you to just reflect on, is that we live in a society that continues to enjoy the borrowed capital of a Judeo-Christian value system that holds life as something to be cherished, that protects certain values. But friends, we're doing it out of purely sentimental motives. Our society is cherishing these values only because we're in the habit of doing so, and it's a habit that we're slowly and not so slowly breaking. And our kids and their kids are waking up to a society that doesn't remember those capital benefits and is beginning to vitiate and compromise the value of life and the values that were once part of what made the country great. And that capital is being spent down quickly. And we're waking up to a whole new set of rules, you see. And those rules are rules of pure pragmatism. Pure pragmatism. Do you know what that translates into for the little guy in society? Do you realize that if the Constitution can be redefined so that the protections afforded the little guy are no longer respected, then what protection does he have? And that's the new age that we're awakening to. You see, that's where our society is opening up, and we're seeing it documented not only in constitutional history, not only in that jurisprudence, but we're seeing it documented across the board in our society. And I think it's time for us to start screaming bloody murder as a Christian people, because a lot of what we're taking for granted is being put profoundly at risk for that very reason. All right, well, my task next week in our final discussion is going to be to try to document in a practical way some examples from constitutional history. I just want to show you some concrete examples of what I've been talking about and where we see this very thing taking place. That may be the most challenging task of all, to try to reduce that to an hour and a half, but I'll give it a go, and then finally try to wrap up with some practical suggestions, humbly submitted, as to what I think we should be doing. I'm not going to advocate radical violence or anything like that, no crazy ideas, but boy, I think we should be doing something. And so that's going to be my task in our final week. So I'll stop at that point. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.